to expand this notion is also issues of changing nature, or changing understandings of what gender meant at this time. Like who are women? What are women? How do we understand women from, of course, a masculine perspective? And these youngsters, when they look at personal relations between men and women, in the 1820s already, but certainly by the 1830s, they reject their parents' models. They reject their parents' models. Their parents' models are passé. Their parents' models, again, are the old Russia. The new Russia is what the term we use is companionate marriage, in which you have two people who love each other, who are not equal, of course, but partners. The male is still the dominant partner, of course. They don't quite use that terminology. But so we have companionate marriage. Now, companionate marriage, of course, is a notion that dates earlier than this in the West. We know that in Europe. And so in companionate marriage, the idea is, excuse me, it's pretty much that you have two partners not equal in which they have very specific prescribed roles. You know, this is the idea of the domestic sphere, obviously, and the public sphere. So the man's job is mostly obviously in the public sphere, the woman's job is mostly in the domestic sphere. But it is supposed to be about love. And this comes from sentimentalist literature of the late 18th century. This comes from the Romantic movement of the early 19th century, these kinds of notions. And they're very much informed by George Sand, obviously. I mean, George Sand's writings, George Sand's writings are pretty much, the essence of what the relationships are supposed to be about, between men and women and what have you. So they're very much interested. And as young men, we know that the young men read these kind of books. They read these sentimentalist literature, the romantic literature, and then as they grew older, they read George Sand. Of course, what's fascinating is, of course, to try to compare the way men read these novels in this literature and how women read these novels in the literature. It's very different. They didn't read it the same way. And also, another issue with which we have to cope is this concept of, if civilization is about polite behavior between spouses in part, as a core component of what a civilized society has, then it's more than domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is just the most egregious problem. The issue is day-to-day relations between husband and wife. And we know that they've rejected, in large part, their parents' model and trying to replace it with a new model, which of course is a new model for Russia. Then in so doing, getting over a cold, so periodic I'll cough. But in so doing, in this relationship, and looking at it in the way they're living their relationships, what they're really doing is, in many respects, using their wives as guinea pigs. They don't know what the relationship's going to be. They know what they don't want. They have some ideas, some nebulous notions based on, again, the romantic readings, George Sand and what have you, of what a relationship should be like. But they use them, really, in all honesty, as guinea pigs. And we know that through Hegelian philosophy, which obviously was much used at the time. Think of Herzen's concepts about torn and tattered books of Hegel being passed around from reader to reader. These things are just absolutely shredded, dog-eared, and what have you. But anyway, they're trying to, in a sense, realize themselves through the absolute. Well, how do you get to the absolute? Their poetry was one means they suggested you do this, the beauty of the poetry. But they also suggested through women. Women were actually crucial to find your way to the absolute. And what we increasingly see, and for example, I know Barbara Engel has mentioned this before, this concept that what you do is women as the means to the absolute they're not women, they're a means. You see, in a sense they lose their humanity, they're simply a tool for these men to realize the absolute. Now again, these men are, from everything I'm reading in the memoirs, their letters to each other and what have you, it's not a conscious decision. They're not saying we're going to humiliate and use these women to reach the absolute. They're so focused on reaching the absolute, in a sense they're doing this unbeknownst to themselves. But the reality, of course, is we have numerous accounts. I mean, think of the Hertzens, their relationship, how that broke down. Natalia and Alexander. It breaks down because he's trying to reach the absolute. He thinks that Natalia is this amazing angel who's going to get him there. And he finds out upon living with her for some time. Of course, she finds out the same way the other way, but neither one is the ideal. Neither one's perfect. We're human beings, so they're not perfect. They're flesh and blood men and women. That's what you have here. But because they have such an exalted notion of love, and of course, love could include friendship, which often does include friendship within the circle, but also includes love of your spouse. And we do know that, for example, many times in the circles, it was common for once a man had met a woman in whom he had a real interest, she had to be brought before the friends, in a sense, to meet their approval in the circle. So, what this ultimately led to was heartbreak, fights, separations, and what have you in the 30s and 40s, because nobody could live up to these exalted notions. It just wasn't going to be done. But in a sense, this is what I'm suggesting is, even in their efforts to create the so-called civilized Russia, to break from the patterns of the past, they made sincere efforts to break from the past, but in their own way, they were just as abusive to their wives because they put them in the same position. And it's amazing to read this. There's a great letter by Vasily Boltkin, the tea merchant and noted Westerner, in which in the midst of the Krylov affair, just to give you kind of a quick breakdown of the Krylov affair, it actually ends up, the denouement, the final chapter, what happens. Elizaveta Krylova, she flees her husband, her brother, she has her brother Valentin Korsh tells her she should leave. Korsh is another one of the Westerners, tells her she should flee the household because she's being beaten, she's being abused. She finally flees and she moves in with actually the Kavyelin family. Kavyelin's also a leading Westerner, whose wife Antonina just happens to be her sister. So this is incestuous in more ways than one. This is actually familial. This is not simply common ideology. So she moves in with them, and she starts announcing publicly, he takes bribes. He takes bribes. Again, in the closed circle of the university, it was understood that's what you did. The youngsters didn't agree, of course, but this is what you did. Stroganov knew about it, but he mostly looked the other way. And Uvarov was known for his corruption, so he wouldn't have cared either way. That's the Minister of Public Enlightenment, Uvarov. But anyway, in the midst of all this, well, maybe someone doesn't know, but in the midst of all this situation, she accuses him of the venality, and then once she publicly accuses him of venality, the rumors had always been there about Krylov, then this is when the young professors also come out and say he has to go also because he's a wife beater and he's venal. This is when Stroganov comes home to this mess.